Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. And what an interesting story it is. We've got a young man, he's a teenager, and his name is Dustin, and he's got a very overpossessive grandmother, and we've learned all about her. How she has a narcissistic personality and how she is viewing her grandson as something she wants to control, more like a thing than a person, and she's obsessed over him. And so that's why they've moved to the countryside into a beautiful little cabin there, because she wants to keep tabs on her grandson, to keep him exactly where she wants him. And so that's why they've moved to the countryside in Colorado. So let's continue with the story, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with our story. The first time I happened to lay eyes on the perfectly enchanting wooden cabin that was 50 years old, that was called appropriately by the name Old Glen, as it had been owned by a hunting and fishing enthusiast, known by his friends as Old Glen, hence the name of the cabin. I understood Old Glen was a bit of a recluse, who thoroughly enjoyed spending copious amounts of times on his own, exploring the great outdoors. He lived to the grand old age of 105. Old Glen had claimed that his robust good health came from living a stress-free life. "People always ask me my secret to living so long. They think it's all about my diet. It has nothing to do with my diet. It's not what you eat, you know," he would say to his friends. "It's what is eating you. That's what really matters. If you want to live a long life, you need to abandon worry, live in the moment. And out here, that's exactly what I do." Old Glen had initially bought the sprawling property, where he had attentively built the cabin himself, with the help of his brother Max. Old Glen was a Denver native, and he fancied staying in the cabin on his own for extended periods of time, and he knew his cabin would likely need to accommodate his extended family members, should they wish to visit him for the occasional long weekend. Indeed, many family Thanksgivings and Christmases had been spent at Old Glen's cabin, as the family had thoroughly enjoyed spending their spare time, idyllically swaddled by the Colorado countryside, and the company of Old Glen, who was a lovable character. As a consequence, Old Glen had paid attention to the layout of the cabin when he first constructed it, so it looked a little like a quaint gingerbread house that was rather easy on the eye, and certainly sizable enough to accommodate an entire family. If he had built it only for himself, which was the initial plan, it would have been very basic, small and rudimentary. But Old Glen wanted to encourage his family members to stay here as often as possible. The cabin was the kind of place you'd be eager to stay in. It was cosy and welcoming, and Old Glen was a sociable character. I could easily see why his family had adored coming here. It made you feel as if you were permanently on vacation, a place where you could easily forget about the daily responsibilities of life, or the grueling work you were expected to do when you got back to the office the following week. My grandmother, Nora Trevelli, had learnt that Old Glen's family had been hesitant and reluctant to part with the cabin that had belonged to Old Glen. But my grandmother had fallen head over heels in love with the place. She succeeded in persuading the family to sell it to her by offering them a price that they could not refuse. Had I been wearing their shoes, I would never have sold Old Glen's cabin. It occupied a piece of land that was nothing short of idyllic. My grandmother had excelled herself in buying this property. I was going to absolutely love it here, and I knew that without a shadow of doubt. When I first laid eyes on the mountains that dominated the skyline, the last thing I even thought about was my school, or even my friends in Denver, or my old life. Indeed, I was so delighted to be here in this neck of the woods that I was purring like a satisfied, very contented domestic tabby cat, who stuffed himself rigid with Thanksgiving dinner, and is happily digesting the rich bounty he's ingested, while wallowing lackadaisically in the sweet sunshine. That was what it was like out here. Even the crisp air was so rich, it was rather like eating a decadent fruit cake, and savouring all the lovely flavours. The cabin was nothing like I'd ever envisaged it would be. Certainly my grandmother Nora Trevelli had told me that one day I would inherit it all. Such a pleasing thought filled me with great joy. The place was beyond breathtakingly beautiful. I could never have imagined living anywhere else in the world as lovely as this. I glanced up in the blue sky and observed 2 masterful eagles soaring into the heavens above my head with their imperial outstretched wings, and I was struck by my good fortune. Old Glen was happily nestled against the prepossessing backdrop of the Colorado mountains, peppered with beautiful alpine flowers that thrust their bright little inquiring heads inquisitively over the lower expanse of the mountains, while the peaks themselves dipped their noses into the snow. Sometimes rather bashfully, the tips hid their voluptuous contours behind the cloud cover, like a woman in a state of undress, concealing her modesty behind a closet door. The property eagerly boasted sprawling groves of trees. There were streams of fast-moving water that snaked through the woods and ran through neighbouring properties. Certainly the property my grandmother had bought was sizable enough, but there were conveniently accessible back roads that led to a plethora of intrepid horse-riding trails that were open to the public and that I meant to explore myself. My grandmother had dutifully lived up to her promises, so that the old Glen property was kitted out with stables and outbuildings. She had also allowed me to purchase 2 American quarterback horses that I was privy to choosing myself. One of the horses was called Fleming, who was the male horse, and the female horse was called Chariot. The moment I laid my eyes on Fleming, it was love at first sight. I had an immediate connection with that horse, for reasons I cannot explain. Fleming had trotted over to me when I first met him. It was like there was this telepathic exchange that occurred between the 2 of us, almost as if we knew that we belonged together, as weird as that may sound to you. Fleming did not seem to be remotely surprised when he was transported to his new home. It was like he took one look at the old Glen property and was saying, "I'm home at last." I knew moving to the cabin was the best thing that could have happened to me. I could spend many hours on Fleming's back, getting to know him better. My grandmother considered Chariot to be her horse, and began to ride her regularly. We also got 2 rambunctious black Labradors called Dover and Pepsi, as well as a plethora of chickens, which also managed to worm their way into my heart. I ended up giving them all names, which my grandmother said was not a great idea, because if one of them died, I would be grievously upset. But as far as I was concerned, everything that lived on the old Glen property deserved a name. My grandmother started growing vegetable beds. I helped her with managing this kitchen garden. So yes, there were many positive moves to living so close to nature and eating the fresh food that nature herself provided. It was so satisfying growing your own stuff, and we were healthier because of it. In the beginning it felt as if we were both on vacation, until I soon began to realize the cabin really was my new home. I had to pinch myself sometimes to remind myself of that. It was a comfortable space, as my grandmother had kitted it out so superbly. It boasted fireplaces, wood-burning stoves, and sumptuous furnishings that made the place so much more comfortable for the both of us. My bedroom was a lot better than my room in Denver. It was kitted out with a king-size bed that Grandma Nora insisted that I needed because I was getting significantly bigger. I had framed pictures of me riding on the back of Fleming that my grandmother had taken and subsequently framed. So yes, I was beginning to thoroughly enjoy my brand new life. When I was not out of doors with the horses, dogs and chickens, then I was lightly in my bedroom listening to music or contacting friends of mine in Denver, with a rather precarious internet connection that was often playing truant with me. I did of course miss my friends, especially my best friend Thomas Barker, but my grandmother had assured me that Thomas could come and stay with us in due course. It was with time I began to realize how isolated me and my grandmother had ultimately become. We went to church every Sunday, of course, and occasionally shopping in the local town. And while I tried to keep in touch with my friends in Denver, with the passing of time I became increasingly apathetic towards them. My attention these days was devoted towards my horses, and any opportunity I could get to ride them. I would be out there, on horseback, riding through the groves of trees, down intrepid horse-riding trails, without a single care in the entire world. And I will not kid, there was no better feeling in the world, and I felt so free. One day me and my grandmother decided to go riding through the woods on our property. The woods met a back road that led down a public horse-riding trail. It was a route we commonly took together, but we had no way of knowing that this would be a horseback ride we would likely be unlikely to forget. And for days afterwards my grandmother would dab her head with a handkerchief and say, "Goodness gracious me, did that really happen, Dustin, or did I dream it all?" I would say to her, "Granny Nora, it happened." "But I don't understand," she would say. "Are those things really real?" But we both knew that they were. I'm not sure what day it was, as when you're living in a sequestered cabin in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, you kind of lose track as to what day of the week it actually is. You don't even care about that anyway. And even your sense of time can go very badly awry. So you're guided by the rising and setting of the sun to glean what time of the day it actually is. Sometimes when we took the public riding trail, we would occasionally encounter locals in the area who were riding ATVs, mountain bikes or horses. It was a stunning morning as we rode our 2 horses down the well-known horse-riding trail. We laughed as we did so. Our black Labrador dogs were wagging their tails profusely and sniffing the ground, on the trail of a scent, I suspect. I do remember it was late autumn. The trees painted the countryside in a glorious rich ensemble of reds and golds. The morning light that gently whispered through the trees covered everything in a spray of glitter. At one point we went up a hilly incline, where there was a steep, significant drop that you would do well to avoid, for if you were to fall down it, you might find yourself landing up in heaps of trouble. Our 2 Labradors began running at our side. The horses trotted forward along the path, and that was when we saw her. Nothing prepared us for such an outlandish, spectacularly peculiar encounter. On seeing her, the horses froze instantaneously. They refused to move forward even an inch. They abruptly came to a very swift standstill, while our 2 black Labrador dogs began to bark somewhat frantically, for they did not know what to make of this tall, dark, shadowy silhouette that stood before us. I think for all of us we were taken off guard, and for a moment I was so speechless I thought I'd been flung into a dream. This could not be real, could it? The humanoid creature that stood before us swung her overlong arms in a gesture that suggested she was indicating for us to stop, but we had already done so. She was larger than life, absolutely enormous, tall and lofty, generously covered in long flowing dark hair, the colour of coffee beans. She blocked the path ahead of us intentionally, as if she didn't want us to proceed any further, for reasons I couldn't fathom or comprehend. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we were observing a female Bigfoot. Her feminine presence and small breasts indicated she was distinctly female. I knew unequivocally that my eyes were not deceiving me, even though I almost wished that they were. I do not know why the horses were not kicking the ground and bucking so that they could get away from this outlandish creature as quickly as they could, or why our 2 black Labrador dogs ceased barking. They became serene and rather mute. It was like in the blink of an eye everything became quiet, as if we'd all been suddenly injected with a tranquilizer that was calming down our base instincts, which might have told us to get the hell away from this absurd-looking creature. I assure you this female Bigfoot was probably the most intimidating creature I have ever beheld. She was gargantuan, ponderous shoulders, overlong arms, and an extremely ripped torso that would definitely be the envy of any aspiring bodybuilder, for she would have made the world's strongest man look puny and weak. I was surprised how calm I suddenly felt, almost as if I had been flooded with what I can only describe as feel-good endorphins, like dopamine and serotonin. Even my dogs appeared to begin to wag their tails, looking up at the Bigfoot as if she no longer imposed a threat to them, but was a familiar, much-loved member of our family. It was almost as if the Bigfoot had locked us under some kind of spellbinding, feel-good-like trance that flooded us with euphoria, casting away loathsome fears, doubts, and insecurities. In the beginning of this absurd encounter, while I was pondering what I was seeing, I do remember my heartbeat on seeing her became frantic. It drummed through my chest at 100 miles an hour, but then miraculously it slowed down. Everything became peaceful and calm. It was like my fear had galloped away from me. Everything was still, as me and my grandmother sat stoically on the back of our unflinching, well-behaved horses, just looking at this Bigfoot, who seemed to have a message to convey to us, as if she wanted our undivided attention. I found myself being drawn to looking into her eyes, even though I didn't want to. She kept pointing at her eyes, practically begging us to look into them. I did want to look away. I was worried she would hypnotize me, but I felt as if I was being pulled into her eyes, being dragged down a long, dark, mysterious vortex against my will. As I looked into the Bigfoot's eyes, I was seeing flashing images going off in my head. She appeared to be showing me something that had happened only moments before, and was communicating to us telepathically, as odd as that may sound to you. In the imagery that she projected towards me, I observed a man on an ATV, falling down the steep incline, in the woods, the very incline we were on right now. The man lost control on his ATV, and descended down the deep drop, and I could see him falling and struggling to get back on his feet again, while wincing in pain. After the Bigfoot had fed our minds this imagery, she proceeded to point down the ravine. I had a sense she wanted us to help this man, who was obviously in trouble. She then turned around and vanished through the trees and was gone. Once she left our side, it was almost as if nothing had happened. The dogs and the horses began behaving normally again. "My God!" said my grandmother. "Did that just happen? Did we just see a female Bigfoot?" "We sure did," I said. "Did you see those pictures in your head that she communicated to us about the man on the ATV?" "I sure did," I said, climbing down my horse. "Wait there," I said to my grandmother. "Don't move an inch. Someone's clearly in trouble. They obviously need our help. That's what the Bigfoot was communicating to us. They must have fallen down this incline while riding their ATV. It is an accident waiting to happen. If you don't know where you're going, that is." "Oh, for goodness sake, Dustin, get a grip, will you? Get back onto your horse, will you? If someone's fallen down the incline, it's hardly our problem, is it?" I looked at my grandmother aghast. Had she really just said that? Did she not care that someone could potentially be in big trouble? "Of course we have to help someone, Granny, if they've fallen down this incline. They could be badly hurt, couldn't they? You saw the Bigfoot, didn't you, Granny? She told us somebody needs our help. She genuinely seemed to care about their welfare, and so should we." That was when I distinctly heard a man's voice. He was calling out for help. He must have sensed our presence and heard our Labradors barking. "Hello? Hello? Can anybody hear me? Can anybody hear me? I'm stuck. I've fallen down the steep ravine. Can somebody help me, please? I'm having a bit of a trouble getting up. I've hurt my ankles very badly. Can anybody hear me? I'm in trouble. I can hear you. Don't worry, just stay where you are. I'm coming now," I said. I wasted no time in getting to the man as quickly as I could. I grabbed tree branches and shrubbery to haul myself rather gingerly down the steep dip in the ground. My dogs promptly darted down the hill with relative ease, putting my futile, rather feeble attempts to shame, making me feel like an ungainly old man. I could see some tree branches were broken. There were stumps all over the place, and an ATV was lying haphazardly among some foliage upside down, having caused quite a lot of damage in its descent. I was relieved that it was crushing foliage and not a human body beneath its heavy wheels. The accidents could have been a whole lot worse, potentially even deadly. Further down the incline, I was relieved to see the man sitting on the ground, his legs stretched out before him, his chinos rolled up above his ankles. He appeared to be wincing in pain. At a guess, he was around about my grandmother's age, but he had twisted both his ankles badly. It was impossible for him to walk. As I could see, the tissue around his ankles was badly swollen. The man's kind blue eyes expressed great relief in seeing me. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked the man, rushing to his side. "Oh, thank goodness you came," said the man. "I'm so relieved. I heard your horses and dogs. I had dreadful visions of myself being trapped here all night. My name's Michael Drewberry. I don't live far away from here. And you are. You must forgive me, but I don't recognize you, son. You must be relatively new to this area." "My name is Dustin. Are you all right, sir? I was very worried about you when I heard you call out." I knew the man had taken a tumble, but beyond that he seemed to be in relatively good shape and in good humour. "I'm all right, son. Well, at least from the ankles up I am. I'm sure I shall live. I don't think I've broken anything, so that's the good news. I think I sprained both ankles at the same time. Imagine that. 2 sprains on both legs. The pain is absolutely excruciating, as you can imagine." "So that means you can't stand up, sir?" "Not a chance in hell, young man. Not a chance." I bent down to examine the man's ankles more closely. He winced in pain as I touched him. "Well, you're right, sir. I don't think you've broken anything. But I do know from personal experience how painful a twisted ankle can be. And you've got 2 of them." "I'll get you help, sir." "I will be most obliged. Thank you very much, Dustin." I was incredibly glad that eventually, after calling for help, that Michael Drewberry was rescued and taken to hospital. He was soon given the all clear by the doctors. It was affirmed that he had not broken anything, which was a huge relief. Me and my grandmother went to visit him in hospital together. After Michael laid eyes on my grandmother for the first time, he fell for her hard. I was to learn he'd tragically lost his own wife to cancer a few years earlier and missed her terribly. After Michael had made a full recovery from his twisted ankles, he became a regular visitor to our cabin, dropping in on us spontaneously, not only to express his gratitude that we'd rescued him from his nasty accident, but to say hello. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that Michael Drewberry really liked my grandmother. "I don't know what I would have done without the 2 of you, if you hadn't rescued me," he would say over and over again like a broken record. "The 2 of you definitely saved my life." "Don't be ridiculous, Michael," my grandmother would say. "You'd have done just fine once the pain in your ankles subsided. Then you'd have managed to climb right back up to the trail and get help, I'm most sure." I could see my grandmother Nora was getting increasingly annoyed with Michael's regular visits to our cabin, although she hid it well. I did privately wonder why she was so adverse to this very nice man, whose only crime was showing my grandmother a keen interest, and what was wrong with that? Michael would bring my grandmother chocolates and flowers, so there was no denying that he was spelling out to my grandmother, in unwritten words, how much he genuinely liked her. My grandmother did not take his overtures kindly, but seemed to brush them off contemptuously, like fleas on a dog's coat. I could not help but clandestinely wonder if my grandmother was rejecting this gentleman's advances on my account. I didn't want her to sacrifice herself because she was raising me. I thought it would be healthy for her to have a romantic relationship with a nice man like Michael. I did my very best to encourage my grandmother to get involved with him. I thought it would do her the world of good. And besides, I genuinely liked the man. And if he ended up living with us, it would be pretty cool. It would be rather nice to have a man around the place, I thought. I'd never had a father, so a male presence around our home would be greatly appreciated. "What is wrong, Granny?" I teased. "Michael Drewberry is such a lovely gentleman, and he genuinely likes you, Granny, very, very much. You could do a whole lot worse. He's good-looking, charming, he's got a great sense of humour. What is there not to like about him?" "Oh, please, love, listen to yourself, Dustin," said my grandmother, rolling her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. "Do I look like I want a relationship with a man? Absolutely not. It's more trouble than it's worth, believe me, I know. Besides, I really don't want to get involved with anyone at this stage of my life. It complicates things, does it not? I don't see why it should complicate anything. It's simple. The man likes you. It was after Michael Drewbury had paid us a visit and asked my grandmother out on a date that she had declined, that I noticed a change in my grandmother's demeanour. She seemed very annoyed. I remember my grandmother saying, "Why won't that wretched man get the bloody message? Is he dim or something? I've had enough of Michael. He keeps popping around here and it's driving me insane." "Because he likes you, Granny, that's why. What's wrong with that? I keep telling you he's a gentleman." "He needs to go. I am done with that man." My grandmother said this with her eyes blazing. I'd never seen her look so mad. I thought nothing more of the matter, or about my grandmother's ominous words. I thought she'd probably be very blunt with Michael Drewbury next time when she saw him, and like a normal person politely let him down by telling him she wasn't interested in a relationship with him. What I failed to realize at the time was that there was nothing normal about my grandmother. In truth, I felt sorry for Michael Drewbury. He was such a genuine guy. It was rather unfortunate for my grandmother to be alone when she was reasonably young, and I thought a relationship with Michael would have been good for her, but she seemed to disagree on that. As far as I was concerned, Michael was a catch, but my grandmother failed to see that. Imagine my immense surprise when Michael Drewbury arrived at our cabin the following day, with expectation written all over his face, as if he was picking my grandmother up for a date. It turned out he was. I could hardly believe it. This was a turnaround for the books. It was something I'd never seen coming, especially after my grandmother's indignant words about Michael had been fully expressed. And yet now here she was going out on a date with him. Maybe she had listened to me after all. I felt really happy for her. I really believed Michael Drewbury would be good for her. Once I left home when I got older, it would be pleasing to know that she had a companion, as no one wants to be alone indefinitely. Maybe my grandmother had reconsidered all of this. I understood she had taken the initiative and actually given Michael a call to arrange the date herself. Michael Drewbury was seated on the back of his ATV, waiting patiently for my grandmother to make her appearance. "Hello, Michael," I said, standing at the front door of Old Glen and watching Michael parking his ATV on the driveway, yards away from where I happened to be standing. I could see Michael looked rather flustered, as if he was bubbling over with excitement, and he normally managed to keep his feelings in check, so this behaviour was rather unusual for him. "For what do we owe this pleasure, Michael? Why have you come to visit us in your ATV? Where is your truck?"
"Oh, hello there, Dustin. Good to see you, son. If you must know, I'm taking your grandmother Nora for a ride on my ATV. So the truck's parked at home. I aim to please, and if this is what the lady wants, this is what the lady gets. You can tell your beautiful grandmother her carriage is awaiting her, and that her Prince Charming has arrived."
I grinned at Michael broadly, like a Cheshire cat, and went indoors to call my grandmother. I was to learn that my grandmother had requested an ATV ride to the public hiking trail where Michael had last had his accident. I couldn't believe it. I did wonder if it was wise for Michael to repeat the same trip all over again, given what had happened last time he went out on his ATV to that particular neck of the woods. And I wasn't afraid to express my misgivings in the matter. "Michael, I don't want to be a wet blanket. I really don't. But last time you had that accident on your ATV, on the very same hiking trail. Why don't you go somewhere a lot less hilly? I don't think it's wise to go back on that trail again. The paths are very steep there. I'd hate you to have another accident."
"Goodness gracious, young man. You're sounding like my mother. I overcorrected my ATV on that hiking trail. I miscalculated the turn in the path, and I hit the accelerator instead of the brakes. It was a multitude of errors occurring at the same time. It's not going to happen again."
"I hope not, Michael, because Granny is going with you, and I don't want her to come to any harm."
"Don't you worry," Michael chuckled. "Your grandmother wants to go on an intrepid adventure to her favourite hiking trail, and I'm not about to refuse her anything. Don't you worry, I will be careful. I'm going to show her a very good time," he said, giving me a wink. "And I'm going to take good care of her, son." "Well, as long as you're careful." My grandmother came out of the cabin to greet Michael Drewbury. She had a huge smile on her face. She was behaving flirtatiously and wearing bright red lipstick on her lips, a wide-brimmed straw hat on her head, and carrying a large bag over her shoulders, which she claimed contained snacks for their trip. "Oh, there you are, Michael," she said coquettishly, flashing her eyelashes at him. "I've been looking forward to this adventure of ours. I thought you'd never get here." "Your carriage awaits," said Michael, pointing to the seat next to him on the ATV. "You look very beautiful today, Nora, if you don't mind my saying so. But then again, you always look beautiful." My grandmother laughed. "Oh, please, Michael, you're embarrassing me. But it's very kind of you to say. You don't look half so handsome yourself." I realised that maybe Granny Nora really did fancy Michael rotten. Maybe she was warming to the man after all, and her insistence that she didn't want to see him again had all been but a ruse, as deep down I gleaned she must really, really like him, and I suddenly felt very happy for the both of them. I thought they made a great couple. When my grandmother approached the ATV, she brushed her hand on Michael's shoulder as affectionately. I was flabbergasted. My grandmother did not do open displays of affection, but Michael Drewbury was grinning from ear to ear, like a little boy who'd been given a train set for Christmas. His face had grown as red as a field of poppies as he blushed. His eyes sparkled, and he seemed to become suddenly rather bashful, like the shy boy in the classroom that has a huge crush over the teacher. "Oh, Michael, before you go, do you mind if I ask you a question?" "Ask away, son. You can ask me anything you like." "Well, I just don't understand how you managed to recover your ATV from that big drop." "It's funny you should ask such a question," said Michael, shaking his shoulders. "I don't know the answer to it myself. My ATV was mysteriously recovered back on the earthen trail. I don't know how it got back there. The thing is so heavy, I have no idea who lifted it. But I am very pleased to have it back." The only thought that cruised into my head was that the Bigfoot we'd encountered that day, who had informed me and my grandmother about Michael's unfortunate accident, had lightly retrieved the ATV from the steep drop and probably carried it straight up to the path so that Michael would recover it again. It was the only fitting explanation that made any sense, and it was a miracle that the ATV was in one piece. I watched my grandmother chuckling away as she and Michael Drewbury sped away on the back of the ATV. I grinned to myself and shook my head as I marvelled how life was so full of wonderful surprises. I had no way of knowing that this would be the last time I would ever lay eyes on Michael Drewbury alive again. It was my grandmother who returned on Michael's ATV later that morning without the man by her side. "Where's Michael?" I asked my grandmother. "I don't know the answer to that question," said my grandmother. "I have absolutely no idea where the man has got to. I must call the police at once. I think something quite terrible has happened to him. I've got an awful feeling about this." "What do you mean?" I asked, confounded. "Why would you say such a thing? Where is he?" "Oh, you know," said my grandmother, "it was just too dreadful, it really was. Michael stopped the ATV and went to take a leak behind a tree. Goodness gracious, the man has got such a weak bladder. I mean, we barely left and he needed to go to the loo almost at once. Well, I heard a loud, thunderous noise and a scream, and then he just vanished, disappeared. I couldn't find him anywhere. But something happened to him in the undergrowth." "What, you heard a scream, did you, Granny?" I asked. "Michael screamed, is that what you're saying? You think something attacked him?" "Oh, yes, I do. I'm in no doubt about it. I began to panic. I called out Michael's name, but there was no response. I couldn't find him anywhere. Something attacked him in those trees behind the shrubbery.
I think it might have been the Bigfoot we saw. Do you remember the Bigfoot we saw?" "No, the Bigfoot wouldn't have done that," I said, shaking my head indignantly, as I wrestled with my grandmother's unfortunate words. "That Bigfoot saved Michael's life, don't you remember? She'd never have harmed him. She'd have more likely helped him. He must have encountered something else on the trail. Or maybe he screamed because he hurt himself. Maybe he walked into an old trap." "You never know," said my grandmother. "I'm just very worried about Michael. I think he may have come to some grievous harm. I really do." My grandmother told the police what she'd told me, and they were practically eating out of her hands. "Oh, it was just so dreadful," she said, tears spilling down her face. "Detective, I fear something quite dreadful has happened to Michael Drewbury. You have no idea what it was like for me, being on the ATV and then hearing that scream. Oh, I am still having palpitations from the experience." I'd never seen my grandmother upset like this before. She actually began to bawl her eyes out in front of the detective, who clearly believed my grandmother was absolutely distraught. I didn't know what to think about the matter. I'd never seen my grandmother behave like this before. I felt almost as if I'd been swept on the stage of a theatre, as I really didn't believe for a single moment my grandmother had been that enamoured by Michael Drewbury, although this morning she had certainly been rather flirtatious towards him. The detective appeared very sympathetic, and he tried to reassure my grandmother. "Don't you worry. We are going to search the hiking trail thoroughly, ma'am, and we shall find Michael Drewbury. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for why he's gone missing." "Oh, I hope you're right, detective, because that scream is still drilling through me right now, even when I think about it. I fear something quite calamitous has happened to him." The police did recover Michael Drewbury's body. You can bet your bottom dollar about that. But they did not find the man alive. The coroner said he'd been bludgeoned to death by a hammer that had been used on the back of his head. The strangest part of it all was that both his eyes had been gouged out with a medical precision. But no one knew how this could have come to pass. My grandmother kept telling the detective that we'd seen a Bigfoot in the woods once, and she was certain it was this creature that must have killed Michael Drewbury. But the detective clearly did not believe that Bigfoots even existed. It seemed that the detective took my grandmother's testimony about her Bigfoot encounter with a scant regard, and didn't believe a word of it. "Ma'am, I'm afraid, ma'am, I hate to say this to you, but someone intentionally meant to harm your boyfriend. I think that when he took a leak and went behind the shrubbery, that someone pounced on him unaware and caused him grievous harm." "Oh, it's just too dreadful to hear you say that, detective. I can't believe that anybody would want to harm such a wonderfully kind man like Michael. The world is a lesser place without him in it. I just despair." "So do you know anybody that might want to harm him, ma'am?" "I can't think of anybody because everybody loved the man. He was so kind. But I do know he had a rather unfortunate relationship with his brother Clint." It would seem Michael Drewbury did indeed have a very fractious relationship with his brother Clint. But Clint had an alibi for the day that Michael Drewbury's life came to a very unfortunate fortuitous end. The police had put him high on the suspect list nevertheless, as there was no love lost between the two brothers. Much like the detective, it never crossed my mind that my grandmother Nora would have anything to do with this insidious crime. I would often ponder to myself as to who could have wished to harm such a delightful man like Michael Drewbury. It would seem my grandmother's sadness over his death dissipated the moment the police left the cabin after their questioning. I did wonder what really happened on that ATV ride through the trees, but I didn't believe for a single second that a Bigfoot had harmed Michael Drewbury. And although my grandmother insisted that that is what happened, I never believed it for a moment. So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.